Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Zerai Hagos from the Department of Public Service. I'd like to welcome you all to this third technical conference in the Grid of the Future proceeding. The primary objective of the Grid of the Future proceeding is, of course, to develop an ongoing utility planning process that encourages investment in flexible resources, which can in turn help New York achieve its clean energy goals at a manageable cost and at the highest levels of reliability. The initiating order outlined three initial phases of the proceeding. Phase one is the grid flexibility study, which will provide an assessment of the present and future capabilities of flexible resources here in New York. Phase two of the proceeding is the first Grid of the Future plan, which will focus on identifying improvements to distributed system implementation plans, or DSIPs, and the processes that create the DSIPs. Phase three of the proceeding is the second Grid of the Future plan and will outline a comprehensive plan for investments, regulations, policies, and programs that support the Commission's vision for flexible resources here in New York. I'll also remind all of you that the Secretary recently extended the deadlines for phases 1 and 2 of this proceeding, and the new filing date for the grid flexibility study is January 31st of 2025, and the extended date for the phase 2 plan is February 28th of 2025. The focus of today's technical conference is the phase 1 grid flexibility study, where our partners at Brattle Group will share initial insights from their research and analysis, building upon the discussion from our first technical conference in September. Today's conference will follow a similar format to the previous technical conferences in this proceeding. There will be two presentations that will last approximately 30 minutes, and we'll reserve 15 minutes at the end of each of those sections to answer questions. We ask that you remain muted during the presentations and that you enter questions into the chat throughout the meeting, which we'll review and address during the Q&A portions. Now, if you follow the Department of Public Service announcements, you may have taken note that I was recently named the Executive Director of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and Electric Transmission. And what that means is I will be transitioning personally to an advisory role within this proceeding. I think the good news is that the proceeding will be left in the very capable and qualified hands of staff like Rob Cully and Andrew Owens to continue leadership over the day-to-day of this proceeding. And I just want to say thank you to all the stakeholders that have put in a significant amount of engagement into this proceeding thus far. The attendance we've had in these technical conferences, the response to the surveys, and just the tremendous expert insight we've received from all of you has been well beyond my expectations, and it's just a tribute to what a great community of stakeholders we have here in the state. And I just also wanted to say, I think we recognize that there's a lot of desire that this proceeding do more than what we've outlined in the first two technical conferences. The Brattle team and staff have taken note of the feedback we've received thus far, and along with the significant responses we've received in the surveys. And we want to let you know that we appreciate that engagement and we hear you. And we've even attempted to modify the scope of some of our initial work here where possible to address some of that feedback. And you'll hear a bit more about that during today's presentation. And to the extent you don't get what you are looking for in today's presentation, this is just a precursor to our filings, and we do expect a lot of additional movement to happen in response to your written comments once the filings are made. So it's been a privilege and honor to have worked with all of you in the early days of this Grid of the Future proceeding, and I'm confident that we will develop really forward-leaning and nation-leading work and policies in the space of flexible resources in the utility sector. So with that, I'll now hand the meeting over to our first presenter, Ryan Pledick of the Brattle Group, to begin with the first presentation. And Ryan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Zerai, for that introduction, and also, of course, for all your leadership throughout this project so far. I think I'm echoing a lot of the comments that were showing up in the chat box when I said—
Ryan, you are on mute.
Zerai, we can hear him. I guess you just can't.
Oh, Noah says that he can hear you.
Sorry, you can hear me or cannot? I'm
Ryan,
seeing,
Ryan, we can hear you. I don't know why Zerai can't hear you.
okay,
Okay.
good. Well, that's unfortunate because I was just going to thank him for all the great work that he's put into this project so far. Maybe you'll be able to view this on the recording, but I'll just say from the Brattle DNV side, we've really appreciated his leadership throughout, and we will know where to find him. He can't hide from the grid of the future, so we'll make sure for everyone's sake that he stays plugged in as well. So we are going to skip formal introductions, given that this is the third technical conference and we have a ton of material to cover. I'm Ryan Leddick, principal with Brattle. I'm the overall project director from the Brattle DNV side. I'm joined by my colleague, Akila Ramakrishnan, who has been our project manager for this engagement and has been leading a lot of our research around barriers and solutions. You're going to hear more from him during the second half of today's session. And then I'm also joined by my colleague, Kate Peters, who has been leading our modeling work and is advancing the slides. And I imagine you're going to hear from her during the Q&A session as well. Also want to acknowledge quickly before we get into the material, all of the support that we've received from DNV in developing a lot of the baseline inputs to the analysis that we're going to discuss today. So we're going to jump straight into it. Kate, why don't we move to the next slide? So as Zerai mentioned, what we're going to be presenting here are draft findings from the phase 1 potential study. The modeling is still being finalized. So in this presentation, we're really focusing on primarily on qualitative insights from the analysis, rather than going deep into the weeds of quantitative results, which are still moving around through various iterations of the modeling. So we're going to start with some quick background just to give everyone a refresher on the scope of the analysis. Then we'll jump into some discussion around how the New York power system broadly is going to evolve between now and 2040 and what those implications are for grid flexibility. Then we'll jump into some of those insights from the potential study. We're going to pause there. That's the first session. That's where we'll open things up to about 15 minutes of Q&A. Then we're going to move into discussion around some of our research around barriers and solutions to expanding grid flexibility in New York. You'll get to hear the results from that survey that we had conducted with all of you over the last few weeks. We'll follow that with Q&A, and then we'll have some quick wrap-up discussion at the end on next steps. So just as a quick refresher on some of the methodological features of this analysis, we've conducted the potential study with hourly granularity and hourly representation of the performance of grid flexibility measures. We're considering the ability of those grid flexibility measures to provide the full quote unquote value stack to the New York power system. When we've made assumptions about participation rates and the load impacts of these different options, wherever possible, we've tied that back to actual industry experience with these types of programs, but tailored that to New York system conditions. The way we've characterized the market and how it will evolve between now and 2040 is based on the assumed achievement of relevant New York policy goals, such as carbon-free power supply by 2040. But we will be conducting further sensitivity analysis to understand the extent to which our findings hold, if, for example, some of those policy goals aren't met or if they're even exceeded. You'll see in a few slides, we've also done some analysis around the existing headroom on the utility distribution system and the extent to which demand flexibility can support electrification-driven load growth at the distribution level. And then this potential study goes kind of a step further beyond just saying, here are the gigawatts of potential, and really kind of from a quantitative perspective does look at how different specific actions can contribute to achieving that potential. So just some high-level overview there on the features of the analysis. Let's go to the next slide. So quick refresher here just on our study scope so that we're all starting on the same page. We're modeling approximately 15 or 16 different grid flexibility options, which we'll discuss on the next slide. The way we've defined grid flexibility options for this study is options that are dispatchable, that are behind the customer's meter or involve directly managing the customer's load, and options where we feel we have sufficient empirical support for quantitative modeling that is based on either full-scale deployments of these programs in various jurisdictions or otherwise fairly rigorous piloting that provides that empirical support for our assumptions. We are going to be, as Zerai was mentioning earlier, considering other technologies that don't fit within that definition in a second volume report that will follow the release of this first volume, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So the definition of market potential, we've defined market potential as all cost-effective grid flexibility capacity that can be developed at achievable voluntary participation rates. So what we're going to be discussing is cost-effective, and it assumes achievable participation rates. This is not technical potential. And again, those participation rates are based on observed enrollment in successful demand response and demand flexibility programs that have been offered around the US. And we are then tailoring those participation rates to cost-effective incentive payments that are supported by our modeling. In terms of the geographical scope, we're analyzing grid flexibility potential for each of the IOUs plus PSEG Long Island, which represents about 98% of New York statewide electricity sales. And then in terms of granularity with customer segments, we're looking at residential, small C&I, and large C&I. And there's some variability in terms of how that split between small and large is defined based on some utility-specific data that we had. And then the study horizon, we're looking specifically at the years 2030 and 2040, which are required by the commission order initiating this proceeding. We're accounting for how the system and technology adoption in the customer base will evolve over that period. Our analysis focuses explicitly on those 2 years and not interim years. So that's overall scope. Just to spend a minute more on the grid flexibility options that were considered in the analysis. Again, what we were looking at here were options that were dispatchable, behind the meter, and had what we considered to be sufficient quantitative empirical support. Those are all of the measures that you're seeing in the table on the left-hand side of the slide. But as Zerai was just saying a minute ago, there was a lot of feedback that we received during the technical conference, and after that, identifying a lot of stakeholder interest in a broader range of technologies than could be considered within the scope of this analysis. So what we've decided to do in coordination with DPS, as I was just mentioning, is after we've issued the potential study by the end of January, we are developing and will issue a second volume of the study that will, at least at a conceptual level, address a number of additional technologies that were of interest to stakeholders. That includes thermal energy storage and thermal energy networks, consideration for medium and heavy duty electric vehicle managed charging, including vehicle to grid capability, energy efficiency and the role that it could play in addressing flexibility or load shaping needs, front of meter but distribution connected storage and other resource types, smart panels or meter adapters, or other potential technologies that we identify through that work. So just to manage expectations, those technologies won't be addressed with the level of bottom-up analysis that we're addressing in the volume 1 study. It's just we don't feel that the data or really kind of the scope is there to support that. But we will be providing a summary of the information that's available on those technologies, plus potentially some accompanying lighter calculations and analysis that will hopefully help to articulate the important role that those technologies could play in promoting grid flexibility within New York as well. So just wanted to put that out there for everyone that we definitely heard you there and are working on addressing some of those comments through that second volume report. Okay, so now we'll move into the discussion around the power system, how it's evolving, and what the implications at a high level would be for grid flexibility. So we'll start with just looking at three prototypical days in 2030 in terms of the load characteristics of the New York system. We're showing just a snapshot for a day in the summer, a July day, a spring and fall day in September, and then a winter day in January. The top line is gross load, New York system load, and then the bottom line is net load, where we've taken gross load and we've subtracted out expected generation from renewables. And so if you look at the summer chart, what you can see is just kind of comparing across the three. But in 2030, summer is still the peak season. The majority of the gross load and peak load days will be occurring in the summer. But what is kind of interesting if you look at that net load shape is that peak window is actually narrower on a net load basis by 2030, which is an attractive feature from a grid flexibility standpoint because it means there are fewer hours that you need to be really targeting to potentially provide summer capacity value. In the spring and the fall, just looking at the picture on this slide, at least those days tend to represent pretty manageable load conditions, with the net load shape actually being flatter than the gross load profile. There could be some volatility on shorter time scales as the system becomes more reliable on intermittent renewables. And then in the winter, just in terms of load conditions, winter load generally in 2030 isn't presenting major resource adequacy challenges, at least relative to the summer. Although we do note that there still is the potential, for supply shortages that could drive reliability considerations in the winter, such as considerations related to shortages in natural gas supply. So the 2030 picture is really still a summer picture, but then when we move to 2040, as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is where load conditions really change on a seasonal basis. So by 2040, based on achievement of various policy goals in New York, the system would become winter peaking on both a gross load and net load basis. So looking at the summer chart on the left, there what you can see is in our modeling, the renewable generation has grown by 2040 significantly faster than load has. So you're seeing net load being, very depressed, particularly in the middle of the day relative to gross load. And it's actually the case that, that summer peak, while it's occurring later in the evening, is now pretty significantly lower than the winter net peak. In the spring and the fall, we're seeing that, flat load, kind of a flat gross load shape combined with very significant solar output in those shoulder months could lead to, by our estimate, about 20% of hours having negative net load conditions, which would create the pretty significant potential for grid flexibility to reduce curtailments of renewables output. And then in the winter, this is the new peak season. This is the season that grid flexibility needs to target in order to provide bulk system capacity value. And what we're seeing is that, just between 2030 and 2040, electrification is driving about 15 gigawatts of gross load growth. And actually, we're seeing about 20 gigawatts of net load growth in the winter once we account for renewables output. So there is a strong net peak demand in the evening hours of the winter that becomes the new target for providing capacity value. Shifting the focus to the power supply mix. So, achieving New York's carbon-free electricity goal by 2040 is going to require a very significant investment in new sources of generation. This means a lot of wind and solar, and then also some combination of long duration storage and some other type of dispatchable emissions-free resources. This will be more costly than the conventional options that are powering the grid today. And what we're seeing in some of the projections that we've reviewed is that those capacity costs could exceed $200 per kilowatt year in current dollars by 2040. So that is a very significant increase in the avoidable cost that could be avoided or deferred by grid flexibility measures. So pretty important driver of the economic business case for grid flexibility. We do also expect to see an increase in energy price volatility and also the need for ancillary services being driven by this greater reliance on intermittent resources. So that is also an opportunity for grid flexibility to provide value, though we do anticipate that some of that need could be tempered by forecasts for over 15 gigawatts of very flexible energy storage that would be deployed by 2040, according to the scenario 2 of the integration analysis. So when it comes to providing some of that that flexibility on very short timescales, we just want to flag that there is an expectation that there will be a lot of battery storage capacity already on the system that is very well equipped to provide that type of service. And that is something that grid flexibility would be competing with on an economic basis. The distribution system and the need to expand it to accommodate this load growth is also going to be a very important consideration from a grid flexibility standpoint. What we are forecasting using I guess, kind of system average based approach is that load growth could require around half of the New York distribution grid to need upgrades by 2040. And so what you're seeing in the chart on this slide is by 2030, it's around 12% of New York substations requiring some type of upgrade. And then by 2040, it's about half. These are, we just want to flag, these estimates are approximate. They're based on our analysis of utility hosting capacity data and also New York ISO Gold Book load forecast that we've applied broadly across the New York system. What we're showing here are state averages, so these values will vary pretty significantly from one utility to the next. And because of some of the just simplifying assumptions that we've needed to take for an analysis like this, we do just want to caveat this by saying what we've done here shouldn't be considered a substitute for a more detailed distribution level planning study. But we do feel it's appropriate for the type of screening analysis that we're doing here to try and understand where the general opportunities are for grid flexibility. So those are the opportunities to address peak demand driven upgrades to the distribution system broadly. But we do also want to recognize that there are some constraints that need to be applied in an analysis like this when we're accounting for the ability of grid flexibility to actually provide that value. And that's what we'll discuss on the next slide. So as you can imagine, I think our view is that deferral of distribution system upgrades is a significant value stream for grid flexibility, and our analysis is showing that. But only in locations where those upgrades are needed to support load growth. And these distribution system load growth and upgrade conditions do vary pretty significantly from one utility to the next. So to kind of convey this concept, we've created what we've referred to as the distribution system value funnel. At the top of this funnel is just, you can conceptually think about a starting point where we would assume that all of the grid flexibility that we're modeling could potentially provide distribution upgrades. And so you could say kind of, what is the technical potential associated with every megawatt of grid flexibility being assigned distribution deferral value? So that's our starting point. As a note there, we will just flag that in our analysis, we're assuming that there is the opportunity to avoid secondary distribution costs. We're not just looking at the cost of, say, avoided substations, but we're only capturing a portion of avoided secondary distribution costs due to what we view to be the more restrictive performance requirements and highly nuanced nature of those investments and the performance of grid flexibility that would be needed to defer those investments. So there could be applications or use cases here where grid flexibility could even extend that value further. But if we just start with the view of, all right, all grid flexibility being assigned distribution value, the first constraint that we need to apply in our analysis is the fact that, as we were just discussing, not all locations on the distribution system actually will face distribution capacity constraints. NISO is forecasting load growth between 2024 and 2040 of between 28 and 79% across the utilities. And based on the high-level analysis that we did, it's just the case that some substations will have enough headroom to support that growth, and therefore, at least in terms of load growth-driven investment needs, those substations won't require an upgrade. So I have to account for that in the analysis. And then the next consideration is, even at those substations that are going to be encountering capacity constraints and would require an upgrade, the magnitude of the potential overload of those substations based on our load forecasts could be small. And what we've seen in our analysis is that when we look at the magnitude of demand that exceeds the capacity of the distribution system by 2040, there's about 35% more demand than capacity across the distribution system. And so what that means is, even if, say, hypothetically at a given distribution substation, you have 100 megawatts, say 100 megawatts of grid flexibility capability. If you only have 35 megawatts of capacity, of load exceeding capacity on that substation, only 35 of those 100 megawatts of grid flexibility can be assigned distribution deferral value. So we need to account for that in our analysis as well. And then lastly, we do need to account for what is effectively the ELCC of grid flexibility options. In order to get a kilowatt of distribution deferral value, you may need to develop more than a kilowatt of grid flexibility capability due to limitations on the operation of that program, such as number of events that can be called. So we have to, when we're assigning value to grid flexibility, also account for those performance constraints and the amount of capacity value that any given program is actually able to provide. So once we've accounted for all those different constraints on the value, we are left with our estimate of distribution deferral value by 2040. It is still significant in our analysis, but also just does necessarily reflect some of these practical limitations on its ability to provide that value. So really just wanted to provide this to you all as context as we start to talk about some of the results. And then lastly, I think we're all pretty well aware of the fact that technology adoption, at least according to New York's decarbonization goals, is going to increase pretty significantly, and there will be a lot of adoption of flexible, consumer energy technologies that will happen between now and 2040, which would establish the foundation for very significant improvements in grid flexibility. So, smart meters, our expectation in our modeling is that by 2040, smart meters will be deployed statewide. Electric vehicles are at only, 200,000 EVs in the state today, but that, according to policy goals, could increase to over 6 million by 2040. Electric heating is expected to increase significantly, as well as adoption of behind-the-meter batteries. So the foundation for grid flexibility grows dramatically between now and 2040, and the question is really our ability to tap into that potential. Okay, and now we'll step into some of the insights from the potential study. And we've kept these fairly high level at this point, again, because we are still refining some of the numbers, but you will get a pretty, I think, good sense of the general nature of the findings that are coming out of the study at this point, and we have included some quantitative results as well. So we basically organized it as a top 10 list, but not in any specific order. So the first observation that we have is, New York's 2040 grid flexibility potential that we're estimating currently is more than 7 times the state's current capability. So where the numbers are falling out right now is this equates to over 8 gigawatts of capability potential by 2040, or around 20 or 25% of the 2040 net system peak demand, which is, again, that peak load that's left over after you've already accounted for all of the output that you're going to get for renewables. That's kind of the gap that needs to be filled from a variety of resources. And what we're finding is, at least during peak hours, there's the potential for enough grid flexibility to address about a quarter of that remaining need, which is pretty significant. Second, big takeaway here, which is, I think, different than some of the other potential studies that we've conducted, is all of the modeled grid flexibility options that we've considered in our analysis are cost effective by 2040. And really the primary driver of this finding is that very high cost of generation capacity that's associated with having a 100% clean power system. We have run a sensitivity case just to understand it at a lower cost of capacity. It's about half of what we've assumed in our base case. Do our results still hold? And we found that broadly they do. There is a modest decrease in the potential, but these findings are pretty robust. Even at an avoided cost of capacity, it's about half of what we've assumed in that base case analysis. So a lot of opportunity here across a broad range of programs. We're estimating that all of that flexibility could avoid somewhere between $2 and $3 billion per year in power system costs by 2040. And the idea here is, most of that could be returned to participants, with a portion retained as cost savings for all ratepayers as well. How that happens really depends on the business model and is more of kind of an implementation question. But broadly speaking, from a societal perspective, once we've netted out kind of program administration costs and enablement costs from all of the benefits, we're left with a lot of value that can be returned to participants and other consumers more broadly. As we were just discussing a minute ago, we do find that there is a significant opportunity for deferring investment in the distribution system, but in those locations with potential capacity constraints due to load growth. And even recognizing that there are some constraints on where that is an actual opportunity and the conditions that would lead to it, we also need to recognize that in order to really get that surgical deployment and use of grid flexibility at a level that can really defer those distribution investments, it is going to require greater system visibility and control, and also a willingness of the system operator to depend on grid flexibility as a substitute for those conventional investments in the distribution system. Fifth, we're finding that default dynamic pricing could drive over 600 megawatts of demand reduction in the winter, and it's actually closer to, I think, a gigawatt in the summer. And one of the reasons this is an important finding is that dynamic pricing provides an opportunity for all customers to respond to price signals and save by shifting their load, and doesn't just limit the potential pool of recipients of this value to those customers that have advanced technologies and are able to afford them. So while I think that the majority of kind of the potential that we're ultimately estimating is coming from the technology-enabled programs, we just want to highlight that in terms of both megawatts and from a kind of an equity and inclusivity perspective, time varying rates present what we consider to be a pretty important opportunity in the US, in New York. But really, to make those megawatts significant, time varying rates and dynamic pricing does need to be deployed on a default basis. And most utility jurisdictions that we've seen have been hesitant to move in that direction. We've seen in New York, LIPA moving in that direction with time of use rates. And so kind of a question between now and 2040 is how much more movement will we see and how dynamic will those price signals be? Okay, so moving on to number 6, we are finding that electric vehicle charging represents the single largest opportunity for achievable grid flexibility. A large portion of the opportunity, the estimated potential, can be achieved through managed charging and just actively shifting that charging load into hours when it's most beneficial. Existing barriers to going beyond just active managed charging and actually going all the way to vehicle to grid, V2G capability, are significant. But if they're overcome and if enrollment rates are high, 2 big question marks based on where we stand today, then we actually find that vehicle to grid could exceed all other opportunities in terms of capability and value. But there are a lot of barriers, a lot of hurdles that we still need to get over before that is materializing at a level of certainty that we see from some of the other flexibility options that we considered in the study. We're finding that there's a moderate opportunity to increase grid flexibility from C&I customers. And part of the reason we're saying moderate is because there's about a gigawatt of existing statewide capability in grid flexibility for large customers that already exists today. So we're already starting from a lot of that low-hanging fruit having been captured. And our view is that really opportunities to increase that potential probably are going to be primarily through automation systems and also potentially the installation of batteries behind the meter of large customers. We're finding that over 200 megawatts of behind the meter battery flexibility could be unlocked in New York City if some of the existing FDNY restrictions are addressed. But more broadly, even looking beyond New York City, what we're finding is that scaling behind the meter battery programs across the state is going to require the ability to stack several value streams that batteries can provide. This is a program option that provides a lot of flexibility, a lot of capacity potentially, but also comes with a pretty significant price tag. And so you need to be able to monetize the full value stack in order to really start to see a lot of traction happening on the behind the meter battery side of our analysis. Given that we're shifting to a winter peaking system, heat pump flexibility obviously will play an important role in addressing winter resource adequacy concerns. We are finding that heat pump control is a cost-effective option in the analysis, particularly if we make the assumption that heat pumps are required to come pre-equipped with some type of communications capability. But even if we assume that technological capability is there, we do think that further experimentation is going to be needed to develop confidence in the ability of heat pumps to shift load reliably and without impacting customer comfort. This is still an area that I think, based on our review, requires further research and analysis. And then lastly, we've talked about things at a high level. We are finding that all New York utilities do have significant grid flexibility potential, but obviously each utility has its own system, is starting from a different point, and so the path to achieving that potential is going to vary from one utility to the next. Okay, so those are the takeaways. Just quick comment on if this is achievable. I think sometimes I've been involved in a lot of potential studies. Sometimes there can be kind of a tendency to just dismiss potential studies as sounding good in theory, but not really being achievable in practice. So just did want to flag that there are a lot of examples of the levels of participation that we've assumed here having already been achieved in practice in other jurisdictions. I think that the best example that I like to point to is in Minnesota. Xcel Energy has enrolled more than half of eligible customers, residential customers, in some type of air conditioning load control on a voluntary basis. And really getting over half of customers to do anything on a voluntary basis is pretty impressive. And the fact that they've brought customers along and gotten them comfortable with the idea of having the utility control their air conditioning on summer days, to me is just an indication that this is achievable. And we haven't in our analysis assumed that every New York utility is going to get to 50% participation in air conditioning load control, because this is I think the single highest number that I'm aware of in terms of participation. But just want to put that out there as a data point that demonstrates that this is achievable. And I won't go through, I guess, all the material on this slide. I think we'll make this presentation available to everyone after the talk. But there are similar examples like that for the other program options that we've considered as well. That said, while it's achievable, there definitely are important barriers that are going to need to be addressed in order to actually achieve that potential. And so my last slide before we pause and open it up to Q&A is just showing kind of from a quantitative perspective how we've estimated that different initiatives could contribute to achieving this potential. And we've done that using residential behind the meter battery flexibility as an example. And what we're showing on our slide is our estimate of net benefits to consumers that would result from this program in 2040. So in other words, avoided system costs minus the cost of implementing a program and administering the program. So before we address barriers, there's about 0.2 gigawatts of potential in terms of capacity in 2040. That represents about $57 million per year in net consumer benefits. This is statewide. If we account for permitting reform and removing the battery ban in NYC, we see that those net benefits could increase by $78 million per year. If we then assume innovations in the utilization of these programs and basically being able to access more of the battery's capacity and use a lower reserve for the customer, we find that those benefits could increase again by another about $100 million per year if you're operating the batteries more efficiently. We also looked at the potential to reduce program costs, and particularly on the DERMS and system side of things, what increases in net benefits could result in driving down costs. We see another $20 million a year in benefits there. Fourth, we looked at the potential to expand participation. There's a ton of work that can be done to improve customer engagement in these types of programs, to make the participation process more seamless. And so we've identified over $100 million a year in net benefits there. And then lastly, for number 5, we also looked at the potential to, again, take that surgical approach to avoiding distribution grid services and assign that value to batteries as well. And once we've added all of that up, what we found is that that potential in terms of gigawatts has increased from 0.2 gigawatts to 1.1 gigawatts in 2040, and that the net benefits have increased from about 60 million a year to over $400 million per year. So that really is just setting up the next portion of the presentation that Akhilesh is going to lead on barriers and solutions, but just wanted to give everyone that quantitative perspective on the extent to which all of the new initiatives that we're going to be discussing kind of throughout the Grid of the Future proceeding, how important they are in driving the type of potential and type of value that I just presented for the last 35 minutes. So that's it for the first session. Ton of material for you guys to digest. I haven't been monitoring the chat box, but I think we'll maybe, in the interest of time, pause for about 10 minutes of questions here to make sure we have time for the barriers and solutions, and then hopefully come back to some questions during the second Q&A session as well. And Akhilesh is going to be my brave moderator here.
Sounds good. So I will start reading out some of the questions from the chat and direct them mostly to Ryan to answer for this section of the presentation. So I'm just going to start from the top with the first questions that came in. On system load shapes, did you look at sensitivities for renewable generation, such as low or high wind and overcast days, that could reduce renewable output and impact on flexible loads?
We didn't hear, but in the volume 2 report, in addition to looking at discussing different technology options, we're also going to be analyzing a pretty wide range of sensitivity cases. So just want to direct everyone's attention to volume 2 for further sensitivity analysis.
Great. Next question is, how much of the assumed load growth for the distribution system estimates come from discrete large loads, and how much from more general load growth?
Yeah, I mean, we're relying on the New York ISO Gold Book forecast, but Akhilesh, you may have more perspective on the details there than I do.
Yeah, the NISO's forecast includes both large loads and more general load growth, and we're kind of assuming just for the kind of the scope of this analysis that the load growth is pretty uniform across all of these substations. So it's not necessarily that, you know, some substations have the large loads assumed and some are just more general load growth. It's the whole analysis is kind of just based on overall general load growth as forecast by NISO. Next question is, how much of the 1 gigawatt assumed default dynamic pricing savings derive from residential customers?
The majority, the vast majority, because we've only modeled time varying rates for residential and small C&I, and small C&I and residential customers represent the vast majority of that collective group of customers, and also based on the analysis that we found tend to be more price responsive. So the bulk of those time varying rate benefits are coming from residential customers.
And to confirm key takeaway number 6 on one of the previous slides, is considering residential EV charging alone correct, not any C&I, either LDV or medium and heavy duty vehicles? I can answer part of that, which is I think it considers all LDVs, including C&I, but not medium and heavy duty.
Yep.
I guess I answered all of it.
You
did. And similar question about key takeaway number 7. I don't remember what the takeaways are, but yes, all of the EV modeling considers all LDVs, but not any of the MHDVs. Next question, moderate opportunity to increase demand flex for C&I customers seems to ignore the new loads forecast to come onto the system, like crypto and H2 and hydrogen electrolyzers.
Yeah, I mean, so we are using the utilities, the large CNI load forecast that we receive from the utilities. So really the extent to which, to the extent that there is growth in that segment, we have captured that as growth in the customer base in our analysis. We did see, I think there were some utilities where they're actually forecasting declining load in the large CNI segment. So it's, I don't think, at least uniformly the case that we will see load growth. But that said, you know, it is, the large CNI class is so heterogeneous that it's very difficult to sort of capture the flexibility precisely in an analysis like this. So we typically do end up relying on kind of some industry average assumptions in terms of our representation of flexibility. Definitely would be interesting, I think, as an extension of the work to drill down further on specific industrial segments and try and understand that better.
Is the $2 to $3 billion a year of benefits from wholesale market benefits, transmission and distribution, or a blend?
Everything. It's everything.
All right. For the behind the meter battery example, did we assume TOU pricing as well as a program, or just a program on flat rates?
We didn't explicitly assume time of use rates, but it's from the perspective of our modeling, it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, it's very relevant from the consumer's perspective, but really what we're just trying to estimate here is system value and whether some of the battery's response is being driven by responding to a price signal or active control of the battery by a system operator or an aggregator. We're just assuming optimal use of the battery, subject to various operational constraints.
And I'm going to try to do a quick fire, get through the rest of the questions in 5 minutes. Do we have a tentative delivery date for volume 2?
That's still something we're going to discuss with DPS, so not at this point.
The FDNY's position is based on, I assume, just talking about the permitting issue for batteries. The FDNY's position is based on empirical testing and protecting public safety. Are we suggesting that their safety concerns are misplaced or should be disregarded?
No, definitely not. And we don't, Brattle hasn't dug closely even into what the requirements are. We're just aware of the fact that they are essentially prohibiting the adoption of batteries behind the meter in New York City. And that's not a constraint that we see in other jurisdictions. So we're analyzing what could happen if there were a solution that would maintain appropriate levels of safety while also allowing batteries to be adopted behind the meter in New York City.
Do we have an estimate in gigawatt of what each initiative or program would contribute towards the total potential?
We do, and that will be in the final report.
It sounds like time varying rates are being viewed as a way to unlock potential. It also sounds like there's value in distribution system deferral. Time varying rate implementation is typically focused on bulk system benefits rather than distribution system. How do we envision time varying rates evolve in this context?
Yeah, so the way we've designed the peak period pricing, the peak pricing period of the time varying rates for this analysis is to essentially set it during the hours when the value stack is highest, when the full stack of marginal cost is highest. So the rates are designed to target those hours when maybe there's some overlap between bulk system costs being high and also distribution system costs being high. That's the extent of which we've needed to make a rate design decision for this type of screening analysis. Obviously, getting deep into the weeds of time varying rate design is a rich topic, and how you deal with distribution versus bulk system price signals is a level of complexity that's important, but basically beyond our scope for this study.
All right. On one of the previous slides, we showed potential for 6 million EVs by 2040. What percentage of cars is that? And did we look at projected household income to determine the affordability of EVs?
So to answer the latter question, we did not look at affordability. We've assumed achievement of CLCPA electrification goals and taken that at face value. I guess Keelush or Kate, you're probably going to have a better sense than me of if we do have that percent figure or not.
Not
the
off the
shot.
top of my head,
Yeah.
but
That's something we could follow up with.
it's a significant percent. For the 2040 load shapes, can we explain the approximately 15 gigawatt difference in net load between midnight and 2400 hours and 100 hours for the winter, spring / fall cases? So I think the question is, why is the spring or fall load lower than the winter load?
The net load, or
It doesn't, net load, yes.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer that in rapid fire. Maybe what we can do is if there's time in the second Q&A session, we can dig into that one and then come back and answer it.
Yeah, I assume there's just more load in the winter with heating electrification than in the spring, which could cover all of that gap. Yeah, but could definitely look into it in more detail. Okay, so are offerings in other jurisdiction programs that aim to provide reductions in system peak demand, or are any of them designed to provide geographically targeted grid services in order to defer specific infrastructure investments?
That was a question of if there are offerings in other jurisdictions that target distribution deferral.
Yeah.
There are. I mean, there are. I think non-wires alternatives programs that various utilities have pursued. I think a lot of people point to New York as a leader in terms of the CSRP and DLRP programs that do target distribution deferral value. It's definitely not nearly as common of an option in terms of programs being offered today as those that are targeting bulk system value.
All right, and then last question. One of our takeaways was that heat pumps can play an important role in addressing winter resource adequacy. Would an electric rate incentivizing heat pumps help?
Well, our analysis assumes a lot of heat pump adoption without needing to get into why. That is an exogenous input into our analysis. The role of rate design could be to encourage, heating load shifting into lower cost hours. So I think rate design could help to incentivize load shifting. I don't know that a rate design that encourages heat pump adoption on its own without that load shifting price signal is going to encourage flexibility. That's basically an added layer that needs to be considered when we're designing rates for heat pump customers.
All right. Yeah, we can move on to the next section, I think, and I'll try to leave at least 10 minutes at the end for more Q&A.
Great.
All right. Next slide. Yeah, so this section of today's presentation is about our stakeholder engagement around the barriers and solutions to deploying and expanding grid flexibility in New York. This is this effort is kind of an initial step towards more of what's going to happen in the Grid of the Future project phase 3, which is as Zerai kind of introduced at the beginning. Phase 3 is the kind of the full Grid of the Future plan, which is going to be a more comprehensive look at kind of the commercial, regulatory, and technical steps, programs, investments, capabilities that need to be created to holistically incorporate grid flexibility into electric system planning. This effort in phase 1 is kind of intended to seed some of the thinking that's going to happen in that future phase. Most of this was done through in-depth interviews, which we conducted over the last 2 or 3 months with 28 different organizations, kind of spanning the spectrum of different parts of the electric system, including a lot of flexibility service providers, all the utilities, OEMs, installers, industry associations, customer advocates, all sorts of different organizations that are involved in this space. And those were pretty in-depth 1-hour discussions around these kind of specific technologies or aspects of the system that those organizations are focused on. Based on what we heard in those conversations, we kind of created a short list of barriers and solutions that we felt would be useful to get further feedback on from a broader group of stakeholders. And a lot of you on the call today probably received this survey if you were signed up for invitations and updates from this proceeding. And so we received 72 responses from different organizations to that survey. So do you want to just say thank you all for all the great information you provided through the interviews and the survey. It was a good opportunity to kind of feed into this process, and there were a lot of useful suggestions that kind of illuminated the issues that are preventing further expansion of grid flexibility right now and how that can be solved through this proceeding. Do also just want to mention that this is definitely not a one and done on stakeholder engagement. The phase 3 is currently out for bid, so it may not be the Brattle DNV team that's doing that project, but I'm sure regardless of who it is, there will be more opportunities for stakeholder engagement and for additional kind of input into the process as the more comprehensive plans are developed. So I kind of mentioned there was a spectrum of organizations. They also cover a wide range of DERs that are going to be really important to scale as part of expanding grid flexibility. So, organizations focused on storage, EVs, heating and cooling, energy efficiency, and a more broad focus from utilities, some of the technology agnostic providers as well. So next slide. So yeah, before we get into what exactly what we heard, just wanted to provide some context on how we had structured the survey, and most of this section is kind of structured along the same lines. So we identified the list of barriers and solutions primarily based on things we heard through the interviews. And we structured those barriers into 4 different categories. They were program and tariff design, so kind of how the commercial aspect of grid flexibility programs is either facilitating or being a roadblock to, kind of monetizing the resources and making it worthwhile for customers and kind of the market to develop new solutions and adopt these technologies. And we looked at regulatory barriers, so it's more focused on the process to develop these programs, get them approved, potentially get incentive support and funding for all of these. That side of the solution. And we looked at technical operations and planning, primarily from a distribution system perspective, to figure out how grid flexibility needs to be better considered as part of the solution to system planning and kind of integrated and actually utilized in an efficient way. Finally, wholesale market barriers and solutions are somewhat adjacent to this effort, which is more focused on the utilities and distribution system planning. But we also discussed that and got some kind of open-ended responses from the survey, which we actually haven't included in this presentation, but will be included in our final report. So the way we structured the survey in this section is we've laid out 16 different barriers across these 4 categories. And we asked respondents to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 to reflect the importance of mitigating the barriers. So we kind of get a prioritization of which barriers are most important to address out of that. Along with each barrier, we provided a few solutions, up to 6 solutions to each barrier. And we also asked respondents to rate the solutions based on how effective they think they are and how easy those solutions might be to implement. So kind of also an opportunity to prioritize the solutions, and all of that will feed into how the team that's doing phase 3 thinks about prioritizing the solutions. Finally, we didn't include everything we heard in the interviews in the survey. There were a lot of kind of more in-depth, kind of in the weeds suggestions as well. And those are definitely kind of noted down and will be considered in phase 3. But the things that we'll discuss are a little bit more high level, just to kind of prioritize how we're using stakeholder time. So in this presentation, I'll discuss the top 2 barriers in each section and the solutions associated with those barriers. Next slide. Yeah, so just kind of at a high level, the top 5 takeaways here, actually in order this time of what we heard was most important from stakeholders, are shown on this slide. I'll start with permitting processes for certain technologies, installation of certain technologies, ranked kind of by far as the most important barrier to address. And kind of like we touched on before, some of the permitting barriers, maybe for good reasons, like fire safety, but kind of what we're trying to highlight here is that whether it's for a good reason or a solvable reason, it's a big roadblock to deploying certain technologies, and there are ways to kind of figure out how to make the process smoother while maintaining safety, and kind of enabling adoption of these technologies. So that was something that pretty much all stakeholders agreed was pretty much the most important thing to address. Second was distribution planning, not kind of sufficiently considering DERs and grid flexibility as a solution to grid needs in the planning process. There were a lot of kind of different opinions around what the best solutions are to this, and it's really something that needs to be addressed, not just by kind of directly addressing this problem itself, but also by just expanding utility capabilities, hardware, software, all of that to kind of enable DERs to actually be utilized once they're installed to provide grid services, and then they can also be considered in grid planning as kind of a more reliable and useful solution. Third, the regulatory process to design and approve new initiatives is perceived as just very slow right now, and there are a few solutions to speed that up and make it kind of a bit more flexible to consider new key initiatives. Fourth, the interconnection process for some technologies is still new and slow and expensive, and kind of some standardization of processes, incorporating new solutions like flexible interconnection and using smart inverter capabilities. There were a lot of kind of suggested solutions to this, and all of those could be considered. Last, the complexity of programs is causing difficulties in monetizing the full value stack. And in some cases, it's just not possible at all to monetize the full value stack because it's just not fully reflected in prices or in incentives. And that makes it difficult for some DER technologies to be an economical option. So kind of refining or expanding the programs and tariffs is another solution that needs to be considered. So I'm going to walk through a bit more of how stakeholders viewed each of the barriers that we asked about in these categories. So starting with program and tariff design barriers, we've kind of laid out what the overall scoring of each of the barriers was, also with a view of to the right of this table, how the responses differed by type of organization. For the most part, most stakeholders agreed on kind of the ranking of which barriers are most important or pressing to address, with some notable outliers, which I'll call out when we get there. But with at least with program and tariff design barriers, there was kind of broad agreement that compensation programs and tariffs not reflecting the full value stack is the biggest issue right now. That is kind of making DERs less economical. And second here was kind of the design and complexity, just making it more difficult even where the full value stack is reflected to kind of like tap into that value stack and effectively monetize it. Next slide. So with the solutions to that, I'll kind of point out that for a lot of the solutions we asked about, because there was such a broad range of stakeholders responding to the survey, responses are a little bit end up kind of being a little bit random with kind of the scores for the solutions not having too much of a pattern in some cases. And part of the interpretation of that is really that kind of for an issue such as not reflecting the full value stack, there's not really like one solution that is kind of a one and done to ensure that the full value stack is reflected in compensation. This is kind of one of those cases where all of the 4 solutions we asked about are seen as pretty similarly effective at addressing the barrier. There's kind of a few differences in how easy they are to implement. But our takeaway from this is that you kind of need to address the barrier through multiple solutions. It needs a holistic framework to ensure that regardless of how different technologies are or how different programs are, there need to be elements that enable customers to tap into the value that their technology is able to provide. So some of the solutions are enhancing the marginal cost of service study to better incorporate actual distribution system value and updated distribution system value into compensation frameworks. Many of you will know that there's a marginal cost of service study proceeding going on, which will address some of that. A couple of other aspects are making sure that locational variation in value is reflected in incentive levels, making sure that changes in load shape, permanent changes in load shape, are reflected either through a program or tariffs or through some mechanism. So that could be important for things like targeted energy efficiency measures that achieve savings in some hours and not in others. For things like geothermal heat pumps, which are kind of in the energy efficiency program, but don't have a flexibility value associated with them. And finally, modifying the BCA framework to consider a broader range of benefits that are provided by grid flexibility. Next slide. So this is kind of along similar lines, but in the case of the complexity of programs preventing full monetization, you can see from the chart that there was a clear kind of winner identified by stakeholders for with a preference to refine and expand existing programs, rather than some of the other solutions, which are a bit more not necessarily seen as a lot less effective, but just seen as much more difficult to implement. Because I think one of the themes of all of the other solutions is that they're kind of new initiatives that will probably be, could be year-long kind of regulatory proceedings to develop and refine. This is things like unifying all programs into one program, creating a distribution level market for providing grid flexibility, kind of things that are much more novel. And it's not necessarily that those efforts shouldn't be undertaken. It's just that I think the main thing we heard from stakeholders was kind of don't throw out existing structures, some of which do work well, keep refining those while developing additional solutions. Next slide. So with regulatory barriers, I think overall the scores here were a little bit lower than the other sets of barriers, with the notable exception of permitting, as I mentioned earlier, which was just viewed, I think, across the board as one of the most important barriers to address as quickly as possible. The second most important one was just the speed of the regulatory process. I will kind of mention, from the utility perspective here, that there is a view that more statewide guidance on capabilities required of utilities to support flexibility was the most important barrier as identified by utilities themselves. And I think that's pretty understandable, just given that I think providing that clear guidance could allow utilities to have better identify what they need to do to support flexibility. And the Grid of the Future plan is going to address some of that. Next slide. So just given time constraints, I'm going to skip maybe to the next barrier section. Okay. Yeah. So technical operation and planning barriers. Here, the most important barrier identified was whether DERs are sufficiently considered as a solution in the planning process. And with solutions to that on the next slide. So this was another case where, as I mentioned, the solution needs to be kind of holistic and consider multiple different strategies within that holistic solution. So kind of all three proposed solutions were seen as pretty effective, with multiple more solutions that are probably needed as part of this process to better integrate DERs into system planning. So some of the suggestions were to conduct more studies and pilots to provide empirical data on the operational kind of reliability of different demand flexibility technologies and programs, needing a standardized process for when demand flexibility is the right solution for a certain grid need. And third, also just giving planners more visibility into where there's sufficient DER potential, where there's going to be enough adoption of a certain technology to make grid flexibility a good solution in that location for that need. I think there's kind of a, especially from utilities, part of what we heard was that there's just a need for this kind of software solution, forecasting solution, to be able to know where you can get the DERs signed up for a program fast enough, with enough potential to be an alternative to a traditional solution. Next slide. And finally, the last barrier I'll talk about was is the interconnection process. Here we actually heard and proposed a lot of solutions. And you'll see from the chart that there's kind of a separation of ones that stakeholders thought were effective versus not effective. The effective ones could be considered kind of a menu of options for the customer or the aggregator to choose from when a technology is interconnecting. So it's kind of really what we heard was you need to provide multiple different options for interconnection. The customer, based on the technology they're connecting, will choose the best one for them. Also just kind of based on their capability to deal with complexity of kind of receiving a signal and flexible interconnection to maybe curtail their technology when needed, as opposed to maybe a customer that can't have, doesn't have that capability, might just need a static interconnection process that involves upgrading the grid. Yeah, I think I'll stop there if this was the last slide in the section, and hand it back to Ryan to discuss next steps, and then we'll have a Q&A again with the remaining time.
Sounds good. And I'll just flag one short question came in during Akilish's presentation. So yeah, if there are questions, comments on that barriers and solutions discussion, feel free to start putting them in the chat. Just one slide on next steps, and that's really kind of a, basically a mini outline of the potential study that will be filed by January 31st. So just to give you a sense of what you're going to see in that study, it's a lot of what we've discussed here. We're going to start, it'll include some background on New York's existing grid flexibility capability, the 1.2, 1.3 gigawatts of capability that already exists in the state today and how that's characterized. We'll include discussion on the evolving New York power system and the opportunities that it's creating for grid flexibility along the lines of what we discussed earlier. We'll lay out a description of our modeling methodology and key assumptions and data sources in pretty gory detail. Our report will include a detailed technical appendix that should hopefully give you a very transparent view into everything that went into the modeling, so you understand exactly what assumptions are driving our findings. Then we will have statewide estimates of grid flexibility potential, again, for both 2030 and 2040. It'll be broken out by program and customer segment to address the question that came in through Q&A earlier. We'll be looking at avoided resource costs and reporting that out by category. So avoided generation capacity, avoided transmission capacity, avoided distribution capacity, et cetera. And then we will be reporting net savings to consumers, which is a combination of incentive payments back to participants in these programs, as well as savings, net system cost reduction for all ratepayers. So at a high level, those are the outputs that we're focusing on in our final report. And then we will include, along the lines of what Akilish just described, a discussion of barriers that are preventing grid flexibility potential from being realized, and then the initial options for addressing those barriers. So the report will similarly include a comprehensive summary of the stakeholder survey, the expert interviews, and some additional insights and themes and kind of organization of those findings that we'll develop as we work on that final report. So that's it. It looks like we still have 10 minutes if there are questions. I'll address one that came in right at the beginning of Akilish's presentation. Did you talk to the FDNY about restrictions on battery storage? No, our analysis, the scope of our analysis is focused on identifying barriers and then estimating their impact on potential. My understanding is that there are ongoing conversations that are happening to try and understand again if there is a solution that both addresses safety concerns and requirements while also allowing this opportunity to be realized, but that's not within the scope of our phase one analysis. And then I will, for someone from the DPS side, I don't know if that's maybe Stephanie, if she's on, but there's just a question asking when the webinar recording will be available.
The webinar recording should be available by the end of the week. Hoping to get it posted tomorrow.
Great. Okay, well, it looks like we have addressed all of the questions that had come in through the chat box. So Zerai, I don't know if there were any concluding, I guess, comments that you wanted to make, but I think at least in terms of the material and the Q&A, it looks like we've wrapped up that portion of the presentation.
Ryan, there was one more question that we had noted we'd come back to regarding the 2040 load shapes.
Oh, yeah, actually, Kate, can we scroll back to the slide with the 2040 load shapes just to try and drill down on that one a bit further? Animations are so great when you're moving forward in the presentation, but then really make it harder to move backward to an earlier slide in the deck, but we'll get there. Okay, perfect. Was it 2040 or 2030, the question?
I'll read the question again. For 2040 load shapes, can you explain the approximately 15,000 megawatt difference in net load between the time period 2400 hours and 100 hours for the winter or spring fall cases?
Got it. I think the short answer there, and Kate, this is where you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the short answer is this is a snapshot from a single day. So it's just the case that on this day, the load patterns and the renewable output patterns were such that net load didn't end at the end of the day where it started at the beginning of the day. If we were showing an average across all days over the season, I would expect those two values to be the same. But I think it's just the day that we've captured here had characteristics such that there was less renewable output happening at the end of the day than at the beginning. But Kate, let me know if that's the right theory for explaining this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think also too, if we extended this and looked at like a 3-day horizon or a week-long horizon, after that hour 24, you would probably see net load at that higher level until the conditions kind of mimicked what we were seeing at that hour 1 on the beginning of those days.
Great. Okay, well, I guess.
Yeah, Ryan, I just there was one other question I wanted to jump in on, which was about the number of EVs in the 2040 forecast. Just wanted to clarify that there are about 10 million vehicles registered in New York State today, so 6 million is a really significant share. I think you appropriately noted that that level of EV adoption was assumed for a CLCPA compliance. You know, as the state progresses towards the 2050 goal of a net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy wide, you know, a large share of those emissions reductions come from vehicle electrification. And I just put into the chat, because I know that's probably not satisfactory to everyone, a link to the New York State Clean Transportation Roadmap study that was published in 2020, at the end of 2021, that fed into our integration analysis and did consider a variety of factors, you know, about you know, what the path would be to get to those high levels of EV adoptions, including, you know, the cost to consumers and you know, demographic insights that were, I think, at the local, at least county level, if not more granular than that. But more background there if you're interested in learning about how we determined that type of EV adoption for the state.
Right, and then it looks like another question did come in. The question is, do you plan to look at multi-day scenarios, especially during winter periods, presumably for the grid flexibility potential analysis? And the answer there is our modeling actually is looking at the full 8,760 hours of the year. We're showing single day snapshots on this slide just to illustrate how load conditions are changing in 2030 and 2040. But our analysis actually looks across all days of the year when we assess the potential value of these options. So that's already in there.
I was just going to add on top of that, since I'm off mute, the coordinated grid planning process, the CGPP, does model a certain amount of flexible resources and dispatches it in our integrated resource planning framework. So in the capacity expansion tool, and then in the subsequent production cost and power flow models. Current scenarios model between 3 to 6 gigawatts, depending on the scenario. And based on Brattle's presentation, we can get more potentially aggressive in future scenarios in the CGPP. And so that will, you know, look at, I'd say, some of these more reliability-based multi-day. It will certainly consider, you know, a full year and 20-year planning horizon as we, you know, identify future grid needs. So I think, like this, as I've said in the past, I think this proceeding is a great way to identify gaps that need, you know, a new type of planning framework or something that is missing somewhere in the planning, the various planning proceedings across the state that pertain to flexible resources. And we would hope that in the long run, we could take whatever is developed here and move it into our broader planning proceedings to anyways, not to repeat myself from previous meetings, but I think that's a really interesting area of study for future analysis.
Great. Well, it looks like we've wrapped up. Definitely from the Brattle DMV side, appreciate all of the input on this call, exactly the type of feedback and questions we were hoping to get on the results. So yeah, stay tuned for their final report. We're going to keep refining the results, and we're just working toward that January 31st deadline. So thank you, everyone.